Back to an all-new episode of the Financial Confessions. It's me, your host, Chelsea Fagan, founder and CEO of The Financial Diet and person who loves to talk about money. And one of the things that we talk about quite a lot on this channel, I have issued several rants on this subject to a surprising amount of resonance, is the concept of self-care. This is a concept that I think is amazing in theory, but is often in practice, especially on places like social media, really bastardized into something that, in my opinion, only heightens the extent to which we are often atomized and distanced from each other and responsible for issues which often are much more systemic than individualized in nature. Put simply, it's often the case that you just can't self-care your way out of certain things. And more importantly, if a version of self-care only exists to reinforce the same toxic, hyper-capitalist structures that put us in that position in the first place, it's probably not a long-term solution to anything. Now, obviously, as we've discussed on the channel, things like a glass of champagne or a slice of cake or a bubble bath can be really enjoyable, but they're also not often what we mean when we're talking about self-care in a way that's meaningful and helpful in the long term, and perhaps most importantly, structurally beneficial to people besides just yourself. Because again, a lot of this sort of Instagramified self-care is often targeting the most privileged people in society to begin with. So I say all of this to say we are always on the search for a version of self-care that is pragmatic and holistic and reaches a lot wider than just whatever we can pull out our wallet and happen to buy. My guest today is the founder of Inner Workout and the author of the forthcoming book by that same name. We'll talk about it and it will be linked for pre-order in the description. She also created a very, very cool card game called Instead, which we'll talk about as well. But she is someone who approaches all of these issues from a perspective that I really respect and think really aligns with how we talk about these things here at TFD. So I am so grateful to have her on the channel today, all the way in from Chicago, Taylor Elise Morrison.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I was like nodding, trying not to snap during everything that you were saying. Yes.
Snap in this sense, not snap like, no, be so angry.
No, not snap from an angry place. Snap like, yes, you get it, because I feel like so much of my career for the past several years has been explaining much of what you just said so beautifully.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks to ZocDoc for supporting TFC. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who take your insurance and are available when you need them. Go to ZocDoc.com/TFC and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. So obviously I did kind of top line it, but I would love to hear, just to kind of kick us off, first of all, what Inner Workout is, and second of all, where your approach to self-care kind of informs it and defines it.
Yeah. So Inner Workout as a company, I struggle to say, are we a media company? But essentially, we're a company that builds content and experiences that help people build the skill of self-care. So we work with a lot of organizations coming in and talking about what it can look like to practice self-care, but also to develop leaders who care. And then with individuals, we have our podcast, we have workshops that we lead every month, again, really focused on the skill building around self-care and personal development, not as much of the like bubble baths, even though I do love a bubble bath.
I'm not a bath person, but I do love a really hot shower. So we all have our quirks. Okay, so when you say skills around self-care, can you just kind of break down what that means in practice?
Yeah, so the definition that I use for self-care, the definition that Inner Workout uses for self-care, is listening within and responding in the most loving way possible. And this took me a long time to get here. I also like to preface, it's at the beginning, like the first line of the book is, this is not an aspirational wellness book, because I am prone to being a workaholic. I'm prone to burning out. I basically created a company that holds me accountable for taking care of myself because I talk about it so much.
Right.
So this definition of self-care, of listening within and responding in the most loving way possible, for me, it really shifted it from having that slice of cake or doing the treat yourself kind of Parks and Rec kind of self-care, to being in conversation with myself, understanding what I actually need, and then learning how to give myself that thing in the most loving way that I can in the moment. And so it's not like self-care on my to-do list, which for most people ends up being at the bottom of our to-do list anyway, but do I know myself well? What is getting in the way of me responding with love? And I could keep going on and on about that, but even that simple part of learning how to listen and learning how to respond, there's so many skills that need to be developed just to do those two things.
You know what's interesting about this concept is, one of the things that we've talked about on the channel before when we've addressed this issue is how so often the things that are framed as self-care are very, very focused on short-term gratification. And often it can be things that for many of us in the medium or longer term end up not feeling good. For example, like a lot of it is centered around spending money in a way that may not be healthy or eating food that doesn't necessarily make us feel good. And I'm interested, when you think about how to differentiate between things that are about, impulse or short-term gratification versus things that are healthier longer term, even if in, the immediate moment they may be more challenging or less superficially pleasant. How do you sort of listen to the long game when it comes to your own desires?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think that points to how there can be many different issues. So for some people, it is the impulse. They go straight into doing that thing that puts them in debt, or doing that thing like, I am discovering a lot of food intolerances right now, and I'm struggling to think of future me even as I'm making food decisions. So that feels really real to me right now. But I have to think with love, not just of the person right now who really wants to have this tomato-based pasta sauce that tomatoes don't really agree with me anymore.
No.
I know, isn't it sad? So that person versus the person who knows that it's really acidic and my throat's going to be burning in a couple of hours if I do that, or if I do that too frequently. So the love is not just you in the present moment, it's you in the long term. And it makes me think of any type of long-term committed relationship. I'm married. I've been with my husband since high school, but I also have a tattoo on my leg with two of my best friends, and we're really committed to each other. And sometimes love is not just enabling someone to do something that feels good in the moment. I think of conversations with friends when we're like, ooh, that person, I know it feels really good right now, but we're seeing a pattern, and you need to do something different. So it's that kind of love that honestly doesn't always feel good in the moment, but it is the most loving thing that you can do. And that's part of the skill building, is determining what feels good and comforting right now and what feels nourishing for the long term. And those are terminology that I saw Alex Elle, the author, speak a few months ago, and she talked about the difference between comforting and nourishing. And I think that distinction really can help people understand if it's just loving for now, or if it's actually something that your future self will thank you for too.
Well, and it's also, I do think that we're at a really weird place with, I think, therapy and mental health and self-work as a concept, because I think on the one hand, we are probably in a better place with it than our parents' generation, for example. So many of whom I think, most people would sort of look at a lot of boomers as they relate to their own mental health and trauma and experience. And you're like you probably could have benefited so much at different points throughout your life of, having some of these tools and thinking in these terms and seeing a therapist and so on. But then at the same time, when we think about the kind of messaging that we're often getting on places like social media, or when people will share insights from therapy or things like that, or even therapists themselves on social media who I think, sometimes, for example, there can be ethical boundaries there, but overall it seems often that we're in a place of not only inherently are a lot of the people who are able to access these things kind of inherently already in a much more privileged place financially and otherwise. But a lot of times I think what we're hearing is a narrative that is extremely self-oriented in a way that kind of doesn't necessarily come at the expense of others, but is often less interrogatory about what could we be doing better? What could we be doing differently? How could we be changing? Like, not necessarily am I the problem, although I think sometimes that's the case. But like you mentioned earlier with your friends, there are times in which the most loving things we can do is doesn't feel good to hear, including with ourselves. And I'd love to kind of talk about how you integrate into a practice of self-care, self-interrogation and changes with yourself that may not be pleasant or may not even feel good to necessarily hear or think about.
Yeah. Ooh, this is so good. So one of the concepts that we talk about it in a workout, it's also in the book, is this concept of a self-care support system. And that includes practices, the things that you do proactively or reactively to support yourself, partners, which is what we're getting into, and then products, which is, I always say, that's like the least necessary part of your self-care support system, but you wouldn't know that if you scrolled through Instagram or TikTok where everyone's trying to sell you some little doodad that will make you feel infinitely better. And so I believe really deeply that everyone is their own best expert. I cannot sit here. We could have a conversation. I could see patterns. I could mirror some things back to you, but like, you are the expert of your own experience. And also, it is so helpful to partner with people who have seen you for a long time. That's why I'm so close with these two friends specifically, because we met in our very first job out of college. So we met when we were baby adults all the way up until now. And we've just seen so much growth, but also patterns where it's like we have the tendency to do these things. It also could be partnering with someone who has subject matter expertise. So actually, before I started really ramping up for book launch stuff, I intentionally sought out a therapist. I hadn't been in therapy for a while, but I proactively sought out a therapist. I proactively started working with a coach, and I really, really doubled down in simple things like my primary care physician had left the practice and I never got a new one. And I got a new primary care physician. I was like, I'm going to need so much support. And I want to start this support like 6 months before I know it's really going to get busy, so that when stuff gets really real, these people already have some insight into me and can support me and can tell me the hard things. We're not like surface level anymore. So I think a lot of it is being in deep relationship with people, whether you're paying them because they're an expert or getting more vulnerable with the friends in your life, your partners, whoever it might be, to say, you can have that hard conversation with me. And if you're open to it, I'd love to have those hard conversations with you too. I think it's very hard to holistically care for yourself and to fully develop yourself in a vacuum.
It's very true. And I think, one of the things that we're sort of circling around here is the concept of the people you have in your life. And I think a lot of people, we talk about it obviously from a financial perspective a lot, in terms of a lot of people are just not in healthy social situations financially. A lot of people don't. This is a bit speculative, but it was certainly the case for me with certain friendships. And I think it's the case for a lot of people. There are a lot of friendships where, for example, from a financial perspective, if you are not able to spend up to a certain point, if you're not able to participate in certain things, that friendship would not be there or would not be the same. And so we obviously, have methods that we recommend for cultivating better relationships and kind of seeking out the right people and creating those support systems. But when it comes to a more sort of like holistic self-care, therapeutic level, there can be a lot of things that make friends, partners, family members not good for you. And I think we're in an interesting space where there's been a lot of talk about, and sometimes in what are my opinion, extremely clumsy ways about distancing yourself from a friendship or not necessarily renewing a friendship or, cutting ties with certain people, including even family members, et cetera. Kind of a twofold question. One, when there are so many ways in which a person could be having a negative impact on you or not kind of helping you in this process of having a better relationship with yourself. How do you identify a relationship that maybe just needs a little work versus one that you might really recommend kind of moving away from? And two, what are ways that people can cultivate their relationships to support this practice in a way that's not, massively hurtful to the other person, which is a lot of what we'll often see?
Yeah. Ooh. So the first thing that's coming to mind is a practice that's in the book that's called the desire matrix. And I think it can be really helpful. I was actually literally just talking about this with my therapist yesterday, to clarify what you want and to identify what you are and are not receiving. So like I would like to have a friendship where people could call me in if I'm being annoying, if I'm being harmful, and I don't have that right now. And then depending on where you're at, and I wish I could like draw out this matrix for you, but a lot of times we want things that we haven't expressed. And then we go straight into, you're cut out of my life. And it's like, wait, but you never said that you wanted that thing. You never tried to have the conversation. So a lot of times the first step is to say, I really would like this. Is this something that you're open to? Or I'm noticing this pattern, or this is this thing that would really fill me up. How can we work together to make this happen? Or is this something you're open to making happen? Now, then if you've expressed it and it's not being met, then that's a different conversation that you can have. But I think there's a lot of ways to do it collaboratively, where you're having a conversation and you're saying, this is what I need, or this is what I'm exploring, or this is what feels a little off. What do you need? And how can we figure out how to give that to each other? Or maybe we can't, but then you came to that decision together through the conversation, rather than just like, I saw this post on Instagram. I'm not supposed to have friends with this. It's over. I noticed this in myself. I think I have a tendency to not directly express what I want or what I need, and then to harbor resentment when those needs are not being met. And so it's constant work for me to take that first step, to have the conversation. And I would like to assume that I'm not the only person who struggles with that. So I would highly, highly encourage the first step to be to really clarify what you want, and then to figure out how you can have a conversation about that need being met and invite the other person to do the same.
This is like, so I was literally like writing down some notes about this earlier today, because I wanted to talk about it, not necessarily in this conversation, although I think it's really perfect here. So for context, for those listening and watching, we're recording this the day before Valentine's Day. And I was thinking this morning about, because I was telling my husband, because I'm going to cook a nice dish tomorrow, and I gave him a small list of like, maybe you pick up a nice dessert, like here's some other things I would like, whatever. And I had this like striking thought of like, you need to set people up for success, like especially, and it's not always this dynamic, but I think for a lot of heterosexual couples, we also have to often think about what tools people did and didn't get growing up. And obviously it's going to vary for everyone, but a lot of men were not socialized to like give gifts and to think of these details that were often kind of shunted to women in family units. And that's not a good thing. I would say I hope that we're raising boys better now and teaching them to do these things. But it's also true that a lot of people in general, but often a lot of men specifically, weren't necessarily raised to sort of independently arrive at these conclusions. And I think that there's such a difference, like you're saying, between if you set a person up for success and you say, hey, like this is something that I would love to have, or I'd love to share with you, or I wish that we could kind of do this or have these interactions or whatever it may be. And then it's still not happening, or the person is ignoring that or not living up to it in whatever way. Okay, that's one thing. But if you've never expressed it, to then jump to not just the resentment, but also to kind of, in some ways, I think, create a story that a lot of people tend to do about this person sort of intentionally not doing it, or that meaning that they don't love you or what have you. I think it's a dynamic that a lot of people live through in almost all of their relationships and never really interrogate.
Yeah. I mentioned before, I started dating my husband my senior year of high school. I thought I was just going to go to prom with him, then go to college. But Valentine's Day is our anniversary because that's when he asked me. He put a chocolate rose in my locker. And it's really interesting. We were long distance for half of our relationship. And I think that did a lot because my now husband would call me out. He was like, you got brainwashed by rom-coms and you thought that people were just supposed to read your mind. Like the man in the rom-com just like reads the protagonist's mind. And I would get frustrated. Like, how did you not know that I needed this thing or XYZ? But because we were long distance for so long, there's only so many assumptions that you can make when all you can do is talk and text on the phone. So we had to learn to be very explicit. And now seeing that even in our relationship, like we went somewhere over the weekend and we will have a talk before. We're both pretty introverted, but depending on the settings, I might feel more introverted if I'm with a group that's more his friends or vice versa. So we'll talk before and be like, okay, what are we thinking for how long we're going to stay here? Or after this thing ends, we were watching the Super Bowl yesterday. I would like to leave early because I know I have to get up and get on a flight tomorrow. And that level of like, this is what I need and this is what I'm expecting. I think it's so normal, but I find that when I'm talking to other people, they don't often express themselves that way, especially with their partner, but in many relationships.
Well, I mean, it kind of brings us to an interesting point, which is the balancing act between things we do for others and things we do for ourselves and the time and energy that's kind of allocated to each. And I think one thing that I'm interested to hear your take on as someone who I think approaches these issues in a really smart way, there's a kind of delicate balance between the self-care that is sort of inherently and definitionally focused on the self and reclaiming time and redirecting energy toward yourself and your own needs. And then everything that we offer to the people in our lives. And on the one hand, especially women are often overburdened with giving to others and are socialized to normalize that, to expect that, to feel guilty or inadequate if they're not kind of overextending themselves to others. But on the other hand, there is a lot of really good data that shows that, the most profound satisfaction and well-being and happiness that we'll get in life is from doing things for others. So I'm really interested in your take in terms of kind of balancing on a day-to-day basis where you're directing your energy and resources, but also kind of developing an internal litmus test for, what things you're doing for others sort of purely in a not draining way, but in a way that really purely gives of you versus things that are creating that kind of cycle of both giving and receiving.
Yeah. So we talk about this concept called the 5 dimensions of well-being, and that's actually the structure of the book. And I won't get into all of them, but what you're talking about would fall into the bliss dimension. And there's 3 subdimensions: connection to self, connection to community, and connection to something bigger. And what you're getting at is the connection to community and the connection to something bigger, which often has a lot of overlap. Something that in all of this, like I said from the beginning, all of this is something I'm continually working on, is what needs to be reciprocal and what does not need to be reciprocal. I think when I started this work, my thought was that every relationship needs to be even Steven, where I feel like I'm giving just as much as I'm receiving. And then when I was in a place where maybe I was being mentored or I was new to something, I'd feel uncomfortable because I'm like, I'm not giving them anything. And then when I was in situations where I was giving a lot, but I enjoyed giving a lot, I'd feel like, should I be getting something more here? Like, what is going on? So a lot of the work that I do, if I put it really simply, is it's like defining things, getting really clear on whether it's defining what you want in a relationship or defining, in this sense, what you're hoping, what exchange needs to happen or what exchange you would like to happen. And where I find we have the most issues, or I can speak from the I, where I have the most issues is when I'm in a place where I'm expecting it to be reciprocal, and it probably should be reciprocal, and it's not. It's lopsided either way. So if you can hone in on, okay, I'm here. For example, I thought about this a lot with Inner Workout and how we did the business model. And for a long time, I felt like I was giving too much away, and I felt very exploited by this thing that I had built. And so I had to figure out how I could get to a place by some of it setting my own boundaries, by stepping back, where it felt like it was a virtuous cycle. It doesn't always have to be reciprocal. That's like the TLDR. It is, as long as you know that it's not going to be reciprocal and are okay with that.
That's so, like, this is something that I've been thinking about so much as someone who is child-free by choice and is at an age where a lot of people in my life are having children. And it is such an interesting shift that I do recommend, if you are in this position and have access to therapy, that it might be a good time to kind of tap into that and sort of recalibrate your expectations to what you're just describing, which is that if you're a child-free person and you want to maintain relationships with people who have children, like, you must get comfortable with the idea that a lot of relationships in your life will pretty much definitionally not be even for a long time, like at least 5 to 10 years, depending on, their situation, how many kids they have, et cetera. But like, there is just no way that a couple or person with new young children, especially mothers, are going to be able to give at the same level that they did before to, friendships, close family relationships, et cetera. Nor is it something that is healthy for you to expect. And I think your point is so right in the sense that, like, when this was first happening, I really did still on some level have some expectations of like, this should be more even. And to your point, like, there can always still be extremes where you're like, okay, this is like ridiculous. But for the most part, like, if you're able to say like, and really be comfortable with yourself of like, this is 70-30 for a while, or this is 80-20 for a while, and I'm making the active choice to keep being in it. I also think that to take it back to the self part, there's also a really powerful element of self-development there, which is, what is the kind of person you want to be? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, do you want to be the kind of person who just kind of evaporates from any relationship when they're not able to be totally 50-50? Do you want to be the kind of person who makes yourself available for various life choices that you may not be making yourself? And I do think that's the kind of life stage that often hits people in the face, because they're not able to truly recalibrate and be comfortable with a different type of relationship.
Yeah, I resonate with so much of what you just shared. And yeah, that's why it's so important to have that conversation, whether it's with yourself in a journal, with your therapist, but understanding, what do I want and what do I not want in this relationship and from this relationship. And you've mentioned a couple of times kind of the overlap between caring for ourselves and caring for other people. And I do sometimes wonder if, well, it's not even a wondering. It's true that America is the most individualistic society in the world. Like, that's just a statistic, a fact. And I wonder about how that plays out for us when we are so focused on just ourselves, just what's comfortable for us, because community care is incredibly important. And we're right now, all of these think pieces about the loneliness epidemic and all of these things that are happening because, I don't know if I want to say because, but it could be colored by or influenced by the fact that we are so focused on getting ourselves again to that place of comfort rather than being in relationship with ourselves and with other people, which, as we've said already, is inherently not always sunshine and roses.
Totally. Well, when it comes to the version of the self that you're not necessarily aspiring to, but that you're prioritizing and kind of focused on, I think another delicate balance that is sometimes poorly addressed in our culture and on social media, et cetera, is the balance between wanting to evolve as a person, wanting to push yourself in certain ways, to do certain things differently, to be better at certain things, or, more adept at certain things, whatever it may be, like that push to evolve, and the not necessarily necessity, but the value of being comfortable with who you are and being comfortable with where you're at today on any number of fronts. And I think obviously there's value in both. There can be, a real level of empowerment in both. But, how do you personally strike the balance between, wanting to evolve in ways that are beneficial to you and the people you love and wanting to just be totally comfortable with who you are?
Yeah. That's what's beautiful about this work is there's so many paradoxes. There's so much nuance. And that's why I enjoy, sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, but that's why I enjoy the way that I approach this work, because there are a lot of absolutes that are presented. Like, you need to, I've heard people say, if you're not growing, you're dying. And I think that's like, do you see the way that the earth works and has seasons?
Totally.
Like, things have to die and then they're reborn, and that's part of how it works. So those absolutes bother me a little bit. Anyway, back to what you were actually asking. Got on my soapbox for a second.
No, I love that soapbox.
In terms of the balance of growing and evolving and being comfortable with yourself, I think it can actually be like this synergistic relationship where I think of personal development or inner work as the process of becoming more of who you already are. And I know that the more I listen to myself, the more I understand what I actually want and what I was conditioned to want and what I was doing to impress other people. And then I start making steps in that direction, and it looks like evolution or change, but really I view it as this becoming, this unfolding. It was always there. I just couldn't hear it before because the noise of everyone else was so loud. I think there's a lot of, and I talk about this fairly often, there's an unlearning that has to happen before you start to learn and grow, because we're never starting from, or we're rarely starting from this baseline. We all have conditioning and programming and things our parents told us and something that someone in middle school said that stuck with us. And so we have to unlearn that before we can deeply get to know ourselves and then get into that process of developing and becoming. But it's not like, I find less and less that I am doing things because I want to change who I am. And it's more like, oh, I learned I really enjoy this, or that this thing is like a hard no for me values wise. And then I evolve, or I move into the direction of what I know is aligned and what I know to be true for me.
I want to take a quick pause and thank today's sponsor, ZocDoc. If there's one thing you should actually take the time to do, it's find yourself a good doctor, whether it's for your mental health, your yearly checkup, or a new dentist because you're still going to the same one from your childhood and realize you don't actually like them. Finding the right doctor should not be an overwhelming task. It should actually be the opposite. And ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. Instead of going to TikTok for medical advice, no shade because as you know I love TikTok, it's just not where I nor you should be seeking out medical advice. I personally use ZocDoc to find the right medical professionals. I actually do use it all the time, and you should too. I'm actually really happy with all the doctors that I have right now after a little trial and error, and I found them all through ZocDoc, and it actually does make scheduling and managing all your appointments and everything a lot easier. I personally vouch for it. And if for whatever reason you're not feeling your best, finding the right care shouldn't take up all your time and energy, and that's where ZocDoc comes in to help. Using their free app that millions of users rely on, you can find the right doctor that meets your needs and fits your busy schedule. So go to ZocDoc.com/TFC and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/TFC. ZocDoc.com/TFC.
I'm really curious on your take on this particular issue, though, as like a subset of that issue, because one of my like all-time favorite expressions that I've mentioned a million times on here is what gets measured gets managed, which is like a very what?
I mentioned that specifically in the book, but keep going.
Oh, I love that. Hopefully not in a super negative way.
I think it'll be interesting food for thought.
Oh, well, I'm excited to read. But so all of that is to say, though, that like I am personally someone who I just recognize that I'm very motivated by quantifiable goals and what have you. And on the one hand, and this can be about anything, and it doesn't have to be a specific number. It can also be things like documenting, journaling, anything that adds to, I guess, the ability to verify or track or whatever it may be on any number of, goals or changes or rituals or whatever it may be. On the one hand, I really recognize that for a lot of people that can be restrictive. It can lead to, really unhealthy behaviors. It can be demoralizing, all of that. However, I also know for a lot of people, myself included, but I think to some extent this is probably true for most people, to not have quantifiable or verifiable sort of aspects to anything that you're attempting can often result in like a constant moving of goalposts and an uncertainty about, where you stand on things. So I'm curious how you integrate tracking, documentation, all of those kinds of things into your personal practices, your personal development, without letting it become potentially toxic.
Yeah. So the quote, "What gets measured gets managed." I used to love that quote. I still think it's valuable. But what I mentioned in the book is I think the element of intention is really important and knowing the why behind chasing that number. And also, they don't actually know who said that. It's often attributed to Peter Drucker, but they don't know who said that. And so sometimes in my experience in corporate, I can think of places where this happened, where people would just put numbers because we need a metric that we're working towards. But it's like, is that metric actually the North Star metric that will move the needle on your business or move the needle on your well-being? Or is it just the thing that you saw everyone else measure? So I think it's great to measure things, but I think, again, there's that definition, that layer of, and what if this number moves, or if I do this for a certain amount of times, if I do this daily or weekly or monthly, what am I hoping will change? And is this the best measurement to get there? It sounds like you are good at choosing the right measurement, but a lot of people are not. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm just going to put this thing on there and then I check the box or I see that it went up or down and then I do nothing with it. So you need that context, or generally a lot of people need the context. For me, I have gone back and forth on how I do this. So like business wise, I'll have a Notion dashboard of like, these are the things that we track all of the time. And I would switch out depending on what we were focused on at the moment. I'm trying something new right now, which has been a fun experiment. I still, at the beginning of the quarter, took down the numbers for all of the metrics that I was tracking pretty regularly. But now I'm having questions that need answers. And my goal is to have a more informed answer to that question. So it's less, what are the specific numbers that I want to see move over the course of a month or a quarter? And more, how can I better answer these questions? And that's just been like a fun way for me to basically engage with the same exercise, but something about it being formed in a question rather than me just putting a number into a spreadsheet has been challenging for me in a good way. And then in my personal life, I relatively recently got diagnosed with ADHD, and there are some things with routine and structure that are just really good. So like a couple weeks ago, we got this habit tracker that's like sits right when you walk in the entryway. And the two things on there are like, did I move and stretch every day? And did I clean for 15 minutes? Because I'm trying to build that, as it's like cleaning is just not fun or interesting to me, but it is something that like generally I would like to be able to host people. So 15 minutes a day, I check that off. And then I have like, did I water my plants weekly? Did we clean the bathroom weekly? Did we mop? And I'll probably put other stuff on there, but those are just like the things that, one, if I don't move every day, I feel a difference in every other aspect of my life. So that's really important. And then the others are like, oh, we're kind of playing with these things. But something about seeing it right when I walk in and then the satisfaction of checking that thing off, I love it. I love it.
That's me, but graying out cells on an Excel spreadsheet. I love it. What I love about what you said there is the fact that you have integrated this cleaning tracking because you want to be able to host people. And I do think that there is, for me anyway, like a good guiding principle in figuring out the right things to track is making it utterly, sort of results oriented in terms of like, what is the ultimate goal? Like for me, I try to be very religious about getting 10,000 steps a day. Well, it's just like an easy arbitrary number, but the goal of getting those steps is because I sleep infinitely better when I move that amount. And like, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to like going to like actual workout classes or something. And I like riding my bike, but it's like too cold in the winter. So point being, it's like, whatever is the path of least resistance to getting to what the goal is, which is like, I want better sleep. And I do think a lot of people often trip themselves up by making goals that are more process based, or they're sort of putting an inherent value in like, I want to be the type of person who does X, as opposed to I want to do X because this is what it allows me to do, or, because this is how it makes me feel. Another big one being like, I'm not a morning person, never have been, never will be. But a lot of people set arbitrary goals to wake up earlier because, well, first of all, it's inaccurate. I point this out every time, but it's not accurate that people who wake up earlier like get more done or are more like smarter, more productive, whatever. Not true. But there is a really heavy social association between certain habits and value. And I think a lot of people get really caught up with the sort of character implications of certain life choices that are totally decoupled from what's actually valuable to them or helps them live a better life.
Yeah, it goes back to that unlearning. I feel like it's whack-a-mole all the time. I'm like, oh, I unlearned this thing. I'm doing like quitting my job. Didn't make sense to a lot of people, but I knew that was the right path. And for some people, because I quit my job and went into a part-time job, it's like, why isn't she just doing entrepreneurship all the way? And then for other people, it's like, she left this job with great benefits and like one of the few jobs that still has a pension. What is she doing? So like all of these people on both sides were kind of like, interesting choice. But I knew that was the right choice for me. But then I had all of this unlearning to do around, like, I was still starting work at 8 a.m. just because that's when I'd started work when I went into the office. And it was like, oh, actually, I don't have to do that. I am a morning person, but I typically don't start work until 10 a.m. because I like get up and I move and I meditate and I walk my dog and I do all these like beautiful things. But I didn't think that was available to me because I was so caught up in, well, I need to do things exactly the way that they have been laid out for me. And that I feel like Instagram is always kind of the elephant in the room, but more broadly, social media, just the fact that we can see other people. Now on TikTok, there was a that girl trend and people are showing their morning routines and all the things that they do in the morning. And then you feel like, okay, I mean, it's literally called that girl. So if I want to be that girl, then I need to buy this water bottle and make my bed first thing in the morning and do all of these things. And my grocery shopping trip has to look aesthetic. There's so many expectations that are put on us when it's like, that's great. One of my favorite quotes is from Amy Poehler. Good for her, not for me. Like, that's 100%. Great. That's great that works for you, but it doesn't have to work for me. And I wish more people would realize that you can do things in a way that works for you. And honestly, all of it, it's a waste of, I'm like, do I want to say it that strongly? But I do. It's a waste of time and money for you to try and emulate someone else unless they are like very, very closely matched to your values and the amount of privilege that you have and the amount, like, there's so many things and we waste so much time trying to be like this person who has a different body type or a different amount of money in their bank account or access to different kinds of people or all of these different things. And it's like, who are you? Come back to yourself. What do you actually want? And start from there.
So well said. I'm glad that I wasn't on TikTok in the era of that girl, but because, yeah, if there's one thing I don't have, it's an aspirational morning routine. But you know what's interesting is I totally feel very validated by your framing of that, because I'm like, I could truly watch a million of those and be like, not for me, thanks, bye. Like, and I do think that is also, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, if we take it back to that kind of like results-based thinking in terms of like, what are the outcomes? Like, how am I feeling at the end of the day? What's actually making me happier or, making life easier, what have you? I think something a lot of people struggle with is kind of identifying when something is enjoyable and additive to their lives, and when something is problematic or, you know, I don't want to, it's hard not to use really, and that's part of the question, right? It's like, I think a lot of times we use very stigmatizing language. You know, for example, one of the things I can think of that the sort of narrative is starting to change around a little bit is substance use disorders, where, you know, you don't want to necessarily speak in terms of being clean. And you also don't necessarily want to be, for many people, too binary in your thinking about these things. However, for a lot of people, you know, whether it's maybe their relationships to food or their relationships to their bodies or exercise or a specific substance or whatever it might be, or work, you know, there's a very fine line between this is something that enjoying something and feeling okay about enjoying it, and knowing when that thing is no longer serving you, and sort of finding a balance between kind of really sort of stigmatizing yourself or being extremely kind of binary in how you approach these things, and finding ways of approaching them more healthily. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that subject.
This is something that like feels tangential. Let me know if you feel like this answers your question. I touch on this briefly in the book because one of the questions I get a lot is like, if I listen within and respond in the most loving way possible, if I practice self-care the way that you talk about it, won't I just like overindulge, spend all of my money, never do any work? And the question that I always want to ask people is like, do you trust yourself? Do you trust yourself at this deep level where like you can be present in the moment of enjoying whatever it is that you enjoy and know when you are satiated with that thing? And I think, and I can, again, speaking from the eye, sometimes I don't trust myself. Sometimes I don't trust that I will be kind enough to give myself the opportunity to do this thing again, whether it's take time off from work or get a massage or whatever. And when there isn't that trust, then we tend to really push the limit instead of knowing there can be more. You can go back. It makes me think of like intuitive eating, being really, really present with whatever experience you're having in that moment. And how when you, I don't know if you've ever done an intuitive eating exercise, but like eating a Hershey chocolate. And if you are so present with eating that Hershey's Kiss, it is like the most satisfying thing, and it's this big, but you're just like so present and so joyful. I mean, if you like Hershey's Kisses, and is this really sensory experience. And I think for a lot of people, because we treat self-care as an item on our to-do list, then we kind of just want to like fill ourselves up as quickly as possible on this thing and then move on to the next thing instead of having it be this loving practice with ourselves. So I think when you're figuring out any of these things, it's an experiment. And that's something that I think is important too. A conversation, like you are asking questions and then I'm responding, and you may be like, I did not think she was going to go there. And then we like adjust and we come back. And it's the same thing when we're in conversation with ourselves. It's this constant dance that we're doing and learning together. And sometimes people don't want to have that conversation. They want to just do the quick fix or the overdoing it because they don't know if they're going to give that to themselves again. And it takes showing yourself like we're in it for the long game. Like me, we're in it for the long game, and we're going to learn how to be present with things. We're going to learn that, like, I will continue to be here for you and give you what you need, even as that thing may shift and change over the seasons. Like, I've had seasons when I've been completely sober from alcohol. I've had seasons when I'm, like, doing a lot of networking events, and I'll have, like, a drink at a networking event consecutively for, like, I don't know, if I have 3 networking events for a week, and I'll have a drink at all of them. Right now, I'm back to being like sober again. And that's just because of health things where I'm figuring out that alcohol doesn't agree with me. And I don't put a value judgment on that. Even when I was sober, I was like, I've never tried being sober before. This is interesting. Now I notice all of these ways where alcohol is centered. I never thought about this before. This is an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I think I always struggle with this from a kind of conceptual perspective, because I think one of the things that a lot of our talk around, again, that is very individualized, often fails to take into account, I hate to put it this way, but the sickness of the culture that we live in, and I personally, like, my struggle has always been sugar. I'm not going to subject you guys to more discourse about my issues with sugar over the years, but like I have gone, like, for me, it's not one of those things where I'm like, I can be kind of just like in and out, because it's like, I'm never going to live a life without sugar. Like, I've made that like clear with myself. However, like, it is very difficult to get in my opinion, clear read on what my own individual relationship to sugar even is in a food environment that is, like, on every objective level, like, trying to addict the American population to sugar. Like, it is nigh impossible to avoid sugar, even in things that are not desserts. And it is, I think, really, and I think for some people, and I think another good example of this is work, right? Like, we live in a society that, like, is in every way tilted toward not just making people completely subservient to their employers, but also treats work addiction like a character trait, like a positive attribute. And so, when it comes to separating out, and like, I have gotten a little better. I've done some breaks. I've gone back and forth. I'm better now. You guys don't have to like email me your tips about not binge eating sugar. I love you guys, but I'm good. But when it comes to people who are really struggling to separate out their own personal relationship to anything in life from the culture in which they are experiencing it, what do you recommend?
Oh, this is every question you asked is like, oh, this is so good. Man, I think the reality, like, to acknowledge that you live within a culture. I talk about ecosystems of care, which are, if anyone is really into social ecology, they're inspired by Bronfenbrenner's ecosystems. And the idea is that, like, I consider ourselves as individuals, we're our own ecosystem, and we have all of these different aspects of us that come together. And then we live within a community that we might have some influence over. And then we have like broader and broader communities, the biggest being like the world overall, the natural world that we live in, which more and more is like, wow, we are not in right relationship with the earth. So I am very mindful of what we can and can't control. And so it gets back to, what can I do to experiment with the things that I do know? Like, when I decided to try and not drink, it was just like, okay, let me try this. What do I feel? What do I notice? And that's when I started really noticing how much of an expectation it was to go to a thing and drink, or to meet up exclusively for drinks, and how often that was the only thing that was offered. And I can't change the entire culture, but what I could change is my level of comfort with saying, I'm not drinking right now. Can we meet up for coffee, or can we double check that this place has like a good mocktail or something else? That was something that I could do. I also could influence the communities around me to say, hey, maybe let's do something that's not centered around drinking. Like, let's meet up and we just plan to all have tea that night, or whatever it might be. And so for sugar things, which also I love sugar, it's like, where can you experiment with there, and what is in your control to influence, and what is like, yeah, our society just sucks in many ways, and we have to deal with that.
Oh, totally. I mean, I also think that the harm reduction method of like treating any sort of substance issue, or really kind of like any negative relationship that you might have with something, is a really powerful tool that not enough people embrace with like all different types of aspects of their life. Like, again, for example, like, I mean, It totally depends on what your particular issue is. But for example, a lot of people struggle with binge eating, especially when it comes to like super processed foods that were, again, relieve yourselves of the moralization, designed in a lab to addict you. Like there's no, like, it's a joke, but like if you gave a medieval peasant a Dorito or whatever it is, like they would die, like humans were not meant to eat these foods. And it's no surprise that we have a hard time kind of, cultivating a healthy relationship. And I do also feel like there's not enough focus. And again, I think a lot of this focus when it comes to like wellness, especially with like the influencer culture and the self-carification of it all, it becomes extremely binaristic where you're either the girl who's waking up and having her like sprouted whatever and her green juice and doing yoga in the morning, or you're someone who has like a hugely negative relationship with all of these things. And I don't think we, at least I don't or didn't for a long time, give enough grace to saying like, hey, this is like a lot better than it was yesterday, or like I just had a little bit and that's not nothing, but it's still awesome and I feel a lot better as a result. And I just think there's not enough focus on like what is the better alternative that is maybe not the perfect quote unquote alternative, but is a lot better for me.
Yeah. And that gets back to like, and responding in the most loving way possible, like possible. Maybe it is not possible for you to not, or for either of us, because I have had instances where I'm like, totally, I'm not going to do sugar. And then I'm like, you know what? Maybe it's not possible for me not to have something that boosts my mood at 3 p.m. when I'm feeding. And for a while, maybe that was like a cookie. And maybe now it's like, let me first try. I got a walking pad recently.
Nice.
And so now I do that when I start getting tired in the afternoon. And that's like my first line of defense. And then if I still want something sweet after that, then I can do that. But like the most loving way possible can shift and change again as you like listen and experiment and learn, and giving yourself permission to try things. Again, like you were saying, the wellness that we are taught is like very, a product of the culture that we live in, which is you are right or you're wrong. Everything is so moralistic and binary when humanity and nature exist in the in-between. Totally. I love going back to nature and just being like, humans are a part of nature. Yes. And we have removed ourselves from that and then get surprised when we act in ways that are cyclical or shifting or changing. And it's like, oh, duh. We're animals. That's why we're acting this way.
We're animals. And we're like not just animals, we're like the little mice that are like being given cocaine by scientists and like just to like see what we do, like we're in a context where to live in a way that is, not optimal is basically a foregone conclusion, and I think that's to kind of take it back as kind of a last thought to a lot of what we talk about here at TFD, which again is like very centered on really financial and professional conversations. I think a lot of people, for example, when we talk about things like burnout, things like, being constantly busy, hustle culture, all of this kind of stuff, a lot of times, again, we tend to talk about it in a very individualistic framing, but ultimately, like, we're in a context where it would be much stranger not to experience these things. And I would love to hear, obviously you did leave the corporate world, but you were in it for a long time. I would love to hear kind of the ways that you were able to create a healthier relationship with your professional life at a time when you didn't necessarily have the level of control over it that you have over it now.
Yeah. Honestly, I still have to remind myself. I was talking about this with my publicist the other day. We were actually talking about doing pitches around burnout. And I was talking about how I have to constantly ask myself, am I being the best boss to myself that I can be? Because even though I work for myself, I perpetuate what I saw before, like having a lot of false urgency where things don't need to be urgent. I think when I was in the workplace, honestly, I don't think I did if I could go back now and be in the workplace, I would show up very differently. At that time, I felt like, actually, I don't know if that's completely true. I'm thinking of a boss who would want to like drop everything because her manager mentioned that maybe he might like something at some point in the future. And it was like, I'll cancel my weekend plans and do this now. And that was not that was not his expectation, but then that was the expectation that got passed down to us. And I did not take that on. I was like, okay, that sounds great. Let me know when you get done with all of that and we hear what he actually wants us to do, then I'll get to work. Obviously not in those words, but kind of seeing, they're going back in the terms of like this almost addiction that we can have to hustle. I could see that it was giving her meaning, and I had to find meaning in other places. So back to the definition and the clarity, really understanding what is necessary for me to be successful in this role. What am I actually going to be measured on? And then what do I want to get out of this? Like when I was in corporate, I started in a leadership development program. Then I left and I joined a startup. And then I came back and I joined a startup owned by the original corporation that I worked at. And in every experience, I knew what I was trying to get out of it. I knew what experiences, I wanted to be able to say, I worked on this type of project. I wanted familiarity with this software. I wanted to get a certification, whatever it was. But I wanted to know, kind of back to the reciprocity, like, these are the things I'm expected to give you. These are the things that I want you to give me. And I will do those things with excellence. But other things I'm going to be a little bit skeptical on.
Totally.
I also just feel like because we are taught to view so much of our worth and identity in our work, that it gets back to this whole conversation on quiet quitting and people like actually just doing their job descriptions and all of these other things that has been all over LinkedIn, if anyone likes looking at LinkedIn drama. And that's been interesting because the expectation is you are supposed to do 30, 40% more than your role. And while I do see the value in giving your best, even if that's a little bit extra, I think the expectation, again, talking about living in a sick society, is that they build in for people to do way more than what they're being paid to do. And that is a problem. I don't think that it's something that just individuals can solve, but I do think by having really clear conversations with your manager, again, it always comes back to like, here's the macro issue. What's within your locus of control, which is probably having a conversation with yourself and having a conversation with someone in your immediate vicinity.
I totally agree. I would actually sort of personally describe what you just outlined there as being opportunistic in a kind of, healthy way, in the sense that I think people often frame opportunism as inherently negative. And I personally consider myself quite opportunist, and I think it can be healthy, which is exactly what you outlined, which is looking at things with a focus of what the ultimate goal is for yourself, because otherwise it's inevitable that you're going to be exploited, And I think it's also important to remember that the vast majority of jobs are like, they're underpaid, they're overworked, like they're exploiting you. The least you can do is like get something out of it for yourself.
Yeah. I was just talking with a friend whose partner is going into a full-time job, and I was like, use your employee assistant benefits. Like, a lot of times, if y'all don't know this, a lot of times you can get at least 4 free therapy sessions. It's called an EAP. People don't often use that benefit. I was like, these are the benefits you need to be taking advantage of, because the employers offer them, but they don't always advertise them well. So all of those things, I'm like, if you're working for a big corporation, make sure that you're getting the full worth of your benefits.
Absolutely. So I would love to just quickly let our readers know exactly where and when they can get your book, because I'm sure everyone is very excited to read it, as I am now.
Yes. So my book is out on March 14th. You can pre-order it now wherever you get books. If you go to our website, innerworkout.co, there's a button right at the top where you can pre-order a book.
I love it. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here, Taylor. And I thank you guys all for joining in. This has been one of my favorite episodes. I can tell there's going to be 0 cuts on this bad boy. But thank you so much. And thank you all again for tuning in. And I will see you next week.